Welcome to the Highland Wonders Podcast, where we share stories and knowledge from experts about the charismatic species and diverse ecosystems of the Okanogan Highlands of north central Washington. My name is Jen Weddle, and I am one of the co-directors of Okanogan Highlands Alliance, a nonprofit conservation organization dedicated to protecting the beautiful Okanogan Highlands. Bats. Growing up, and even still today, my all-time favorite comic is Calvin and Hobbes by Bill Watterson. And one of the greatest episodes was Calvin's report on bats, which he presented in his classic dramatic fashion to his first grade class.
Dusk, with a creepy, tingling sensation, you hear the fluttering of leathery wings. Bats, with glowing red eyes and glistening fangs, these unspeakable giant bugs drop onto.
At which point, the class yells,
"Bats are bugs!"
leading Calvin to call his classmates chowderheads and this teacher to call him to her desk. So funny, so genius, and educational too. In this episode, Roger Christophersen, wildlife biologist with the North Cascades National Park, will add to your bank of knowledge of bats, focusing on the species that inhabit the Okanogan. Whether or not you're already a huge fan of bats, you'll learn something new and find a reason to appreciate these flying fuzzballs. So enjoy!
Life is what we make it. It's all that we are. We're all what it is, 'cause we're living with blessed unrest.
My name is Roger Christophersen, and I work as a wildlife biologist for the North Cascades National Park. Through that, I've worked with a lot of different mammal and bird species, and tonight we're going to talk about bats. And I do think that that's one of my most favorite species. I've been dabbling with it for the last decade, probably. And we're still continuing to do some surveys way out into the San Juan Islands, even. You live in one beautiful place here, there's no question. And you all live here for a reason, right? Let me just guess. You got 4 seasons, you got abundance of culture, history, wildlife, diversity in all those things, and fish as well. And let me guess, maybe low density of people. Did I miss anything? Very few stoplights, right on. Beautiful place. Anyway, the secret life of bats in the Okanogan Highlands and beyond. And we say beyond because we're going to go over into Sinlahican and some of those areas as well. We're going to look at some of the benefits of bats, both ecologically and economically. Some of the public health issues, a little bit about natural history, and we'll move into some of the habitat requirements that they have and how to ID a bat. It's not easy. It's one of the most difficult mammals to ID, actually. We'll talk a little bit about some of the research I've done and, again, down into some of the threats and conservation needs and what you can do to help in bat conservation. So, why study bats, or who cares? Why are bats important? Well, probably first and foremost is I think they are a very charismatic mini fauna as opposed to megafauna. Once you touch one, it changes your life. I've taught some of these adult classes where we actually trap and catch bats, and when these people touch those, they have a whole other opinion of bats. 70% of the world's bats are insectivores, meaning they only eat insects. And in fact, all the bats you have in the Okanogan Highlands are insect eaters. We call that insectivorous. So that said, ecologically, they play a very important role in keeping check on the insect population. Without that, we'd be using many more herbicides, pesticides, and whatnot, which is bad for our own health and the health of the planet. So they're very important in this respect. I'm sure you didn't know there'd be math, but I just want to drive home this point about how many insects a bat can eat in one evening. And then we'll go on to 1 week and a month and a whole summer. consisting of 6 months. So you probably all got one of those calculators on your cell phone, but I'll help you out. One small-sized bat, like a little brown bat, can catch about 600 mosquitoes or mosies an hour. And they feed about 2 to 3 hours a night, but we'll just stay on the conservative side and say 2 hours. And so how many mosies would it catch in 1 week? One bat. Pretty easy math so far. 600 times 2 hours, 1,200 mosies times 7 nights a week, 8,400 mosies in 1 week for one bat. It gets more complex. For a month, you just take that times 4 and you get 33,600 mosquitoes. And for a summer, times 6 months is 201,000 mosquitoes. Now it gets really complex. Assume the average size of a colony is about 200 bats. That seems to be about average. It can be less, or it could be in the millions, actually, some of these. Let's just say 200 for the sake of easy math. So in 1 week, you have over 1 million bugs that this colony of 200 bats just consumed. That's pretty cool. In a month, and it's 6 million. And then in the summer, 40 million bugs or mosquitoes. Isn't that amazing? Now you get the picture. They are ecologically and economically important. There might be a quiz on that later. You'll have to do the math. You probably heard about the Congress Bridge down in Austin, Texas, and that has 1.5 million Mexican free-tailed bats that come from underneath the bridge each evening. And so they're catching about 30,000 pounds of bugs every night. Can you imagine? I don't know how to put that in weight, but how much does a dump truck hold? A lot. That'd be several dump trucks worth of bugs every night. So despite all these benefits, who hasn't heard a bad story about bats? They got a bad rap, but a lot of it's myth and don't believe it. For example, they don't get tangled in your hair, and they don't suck your blood dry, and they're not blind as a bat, and all those myths you've heard. So they deserve to be understood and appreciated, and that's the greatest thing that you can do to help bats, and just understanding them and telling other people as well. So public health issues. It is true that bats are a reservoir for rabies, but so are a lot of mammals, skunks, raccoons, neighborhood dogs that haven't been vaccinated, on and on. 0.1% actually carry the rabies virus. So rabies itself is a viral infection, and once you have it, you need to get some shots to turn it around, or else it is lethal. It's very, very lethal. One of the most lethal viruses in the country, actually. So that part doesn't sound so good. But since 1953, there's only been 10 related bat deaths from rabies. Dogs, before the vaccination came out, were much more of a carrier than bats ever have been. Just skiing in the backcountry can be more dangerous, or any number of other crazy things we do. There's another thing going on that's called histoplasmosis infection. Well, it's a fungus, actually, a respiratory fungus that kind of thrives in either bat guano or the droppings of other animals. And if you kind of stir that up, you could be susceptible to this little respiratory thing. It's fairly benign, even if you were to contract it. So not a big deal. Best to just wear a mask. So the gist is, with simple precautions, bats present little risk to human health, despite everything we've heard. Just to be safe, though, when I handle bats, I generally wear a glove on one hand, at least. Some of our smaller bats, their mandibles aren't really strong enough to penetrate your skin anyway, so they pose little threat. Some of the larger bats, they could pierce your skin, so it's best to be safe. Even when you handle one in your cabin or your house, you really ought to wear a glove, and you can remove them yourself, actually. Looking back at the fossil record, these little critters date back 50 million years ago, and they seem to have evolved from some quadrupedal insectivore, and they eventually evolved into what they are now, but they lost their locomotory function of the hind legs, and that's why, in part, they can't bear weight on their legs, so they actually hang upside down. That's one theory anyway, and a lot of people ask this, why do bats hang upside down? Well, that's one reason, and another reason is Seems they need to have this, what's called a swoop zone. They have to go down and then up to catch some air first. There's a lot of bats in the world, about as many as there are ice cream flavors. They're found on every continent except Antarctica. And they range in size from the tiny little bumblebee bat that's about the size, it weighs about as much as a penny, and it's the size of a bumblebee. It's pretty small. Up to the large fruit-eating bat, frugivores, they call them, in the South Pacific. And these are actually still harvested by some of the native people of these South Pacific islands. But their wingspan's like a bald eagle. It's almost 6 feet. Isn't that amazing? There's 1,100 species worldwide. And there's about 45 in the U.S., half of which are listed or about to be listed or endangered in some way. So about 40 to 50% of those are endangered. There seems to be about 16 to 17 species in the Pacific Northwest. And as we narrow it down to home here, there's about 13 to 15. That's a little bit of a range because there's some ambiguity as to what's really here. Sometimes they're misidentified, or sometimes they had a echolocation call that they went by but didn't actually have the bat in the hand. So that's not really the best evidence. So there's some work to be done yet. But that's a lot. And generally you find in the warmer climates like the tropics, for example, will have the greatest diversity. And then even in the U.S., like in Texas, they have like 38 species, Arizona, maybe 25. You get up in Maine and maybe 8 species. Alaska, amazingly, has about 6 species. And so, you have quite a few here. You have more here on the east side of the mountains than you do on the west side, I've come to find, only by a couple different species. Here in the Highlands, 7 or 8 are in the Myotis genus, and I'll use that word quite a bit. Myotis means mouse-eared. So they're the smaller bats. I refer to those like the Cessnas, small bats, and then big brown bats, silver-haired, Townsends and Hoary. Those are like the 747s. So you have different size classes and different little niches that each of them fill and different bugs that they eat. It's pretty amazing, actually. A lot of diversity. At least half are listed or monitored or in some type of peril at this point. The Townsend's big-eared bat is a candidate species for the state of Washington. It's at the highest risk, and you do have them here, I've come to find. So that's pretty cool. Looking at a bat's wing, it very closely resembles the human hand. In fact, the order of bats is Chiroptera, as opposed to Rodentia. They are not rodents. They have an order of their own called Chiroptera, means hand-winged. And you look at a human hand, and a bat has the same thing. It has a thumb and basically 4 additional fingers. Very different than a bird, which is more like an arm. If you see a bat and you want to know what kind it is, look at the length of the ears. Are they long or are they very short, like a mouse? We have both kinds and probably everything in between, actually. So that's one thing that we measure quite often. And another thing is the forearm. The length of the forearm is a key thing. And then the overall size of the bat is also quite important. We're just going to take a quick look at what bats do during the year here. The bat calendar. In April, you're going to have bats coming out. They've been in hibernation or migrated south through the whole winter. And in early April, they start showing up. And then in May, there's this gender segregation. This is kind of unusual in mammals in that let me back up a little bit. Back in October or so is when breeding takes place, but it's a delayed implantation. And what that means is the egg is not fertilized until May. Probably is some evolution having to do with is the bug population appropriate to have young? So there's this segregation, and the males leave, and they have nothing to do with rearing the young from there on. They don't kind of converge again until the breeding period in October. In June, typically, the young are born. The young are called pups. They usually have just one pup. They're incidentally the slowest reproducing mammal on the planet for their size. So bat populations don't increase or decrease very quickly. They are pretty stable for the most part. and they're very long-lived. Any idea how long a bat can live? Let's just say a little brown bat, common bat. Any guesses? 15, I heard. 50? 10? You're all right, except maybe 50 is a little high. They might turn gray by then. Yeah. It's been known to be over 30 years. Yeah, that's pretty long-lived. Most mammals are between 5 and 10, 12 years. In July, so they're born viviparous, which means they are alive and their eyes are opened and they nurse milk. And in about 6 weeks, they're able to fly on their own. And then in the meantime, the mother bat will carry her young on her back for some feeding bouts. They just take them with them until they get such size that they're too heavy and bogs them down. We'll get into that a little bit more later. In September, again, even into October, the mating period starts again. And then October to March, they either migrate or hibernate in caves, mines, and etc. Their heartbeat falls to as little as 6 beats a minute. They're really in a deep sleep. This is the most critical time in a bat's life cycle, is when they're hibernating. That's when we want to avoid waking them up, because they lose all their fat reserves really quickly. They're a small mammal, really small, and any awakening can have a negative impact. Whether bats come back to the same site year after year, we don't know. It's pretty cool that bats live where they work. They got it going on, a little different than us humans sometimes. In that they don't have to deal with these long commutes. Everything they need, food, water, shelter, is usually within 1/4 of a mile from where they live. So the key, wherever you have water, you're going to have bats nearby, because that's almost predictably the first thing they're going to do in the evening when they come out of the roost is go towards some water and get a drink. They'll just swoop down and grab it with their tongue and they're off. Because just think, they've been up in some hot attic or in the sun all day long just roasting. They need some water. So it's pretty cool. Everything is pretty close by. Forest habitat is pretty critical habitat, especially up here in the highlands. Dead trees are very important. They crawl up under that bark that creates a really nice roost. Or if you have older trees, into the cracks, and dead snags that have old pileated woodpecker cavities, perfect for bats. They usually select some of the tallest trees because bats, it's all about warmth and solar energy. So if they can be above the canopy, all the better. So one of the biggest things that forest management can do is have a snag retention program in their forest plan. And we've learned that it's good to have a clump of snags so that they can change their location even within the hour. As the sun rotates, they want to follow it, or if it's too hot, they can go on the backside or change it up a little bit. And interesting enough, there's a couple of species, the true tree bats, such as hoary bat, red bat, silver-haired bat. They actually use the foliage of some of our deciduous trees, aspen and cottonwoods primarily, in the riparian areas. So those are important components for roosting habitat. And also up in your neck of the woods here, for sure, they're using a lot of the rock crevices that you have. You have cliffs everywhere. That's what makes it hard to ever find these roost areas, though. There's so much territory to cover. Buildings, either on the outside, and then around the highlands, as you know, you have a lot of these old abandoned buildings. I wouldn't be surprised that a lot of those have some bats in them. They're kind of particular. They don't like to have a draft, so anything with a holey roof or windows broken out, probably not so good. But when it has a roof intact and they can get up there, in all likelihood, they're using that. And under the metal flashing or the metal roofing, too, they like that. A great place to look for bats. You can do this on your own any evening in the summer. Just stop at some bridge, a cement bridge. Those ones that are casted in place are the best. Look on one end or the other, and you'll probably see some bats roosting under there in the evening. What happens is they have a big foraging bout for a couple hours, and they're pretty full. So they'll hang up under these bridges and digest their food for a little bit, and then maybe go out for a little more. Or, I don't know if you've noticed it, but sometimes like 4 or 5 p.m., you'll see bats going across the road in front of your car. I have seen this anyway. And what's happening is they're going back to their regular day roost from hanging up under these bridges quite often. You know, these bridges are like solar collectors all day long, so they work quite well. And of course, you have a fair amount of caves and mines up in this area, and that's a whole other world to explore. And actually, the mines tend to mimic the relative humidity and the temperature and airflow of a cave, so they tend to use these mines quite a bit now. Problem with this is that there's a momentum to close these mines for human safety, because people have been known to go into these. In Idaho, somebody was killed not too long ago because they went in there and stirred up some gas that was on the bottom. So they try to put these blockades on them, but now we're learning that we can serve both purposes. We can close the mine and put like a bat gate, they call it, so the bats can get through and yet keep humans out. So that's the new trend. The whole idea, again, is bats are all about, 1, energy expenditure, and 2, warmth. You know, bats like it at about 99 to 104 degrees. That's why you find them in the attics quite often. It's so hot we can't stand it, but bats love it. So they'll huddle up. They'll each have their individual pup with them, and they know who's who. Now that's amazing. It's based on smell and some verbal communication. We count bats from a colony in the evening just before dusk, or right at dusk. They'll start to come out. Initially a couple at a time, and then 3 or 4, and 10 or 12, and 50 or 60 at a time. So you need a few eyes to count them all, but it works pretty effectively. Sometimes there's been some where I've seen over 1,500 to 2,000 bats come out of a building. Bats have this unique thing called, it's like a built-in radar. They have what we call echolocation capability. What it is, basically, they emit this sound from their throat or their nose, and it bounces off of their target, and then they hear with their ears and they hone in on it. They know exactly how big that object is, how far away it is, which direction it's traveling, and etc. And that's called echolocation. It's pretty unique. No other animal on the planet has that. So anyway, this action has happened in milliseconds, bouncing these signals off constantly. So we can record these calls. Here's an example of a recording to let you know what a bat sounds like. These little echolocator machines that we have, they're called anabat detectors. They kind of divide the signal by 16 so that we can hear it with a human ear. Can y'all hear that? You can't hear that out in your garage or out in your yard. That's a bat just flying around and just echolocating all the time. You heard this little zzz. That's a feeding buzz, and there's one of those about every minute because they're just constantly eating bugs. I'll see if I can just find the feeding buzz. That's what we call it. Zzz. Yeah, he just got a bug. So that call was from a small-sized bat. We just know, it's kind of like when you get good at this, you can kind of do it like birding. You just know, you can carry one of these around, the echolocator. So there's a bat flying around, and you just follow the bat around, and you can hear what the sound that we just heard there. And there's a lot of different calls, a lot of different sounds, and you kind of work with it, and you can identify bats without ever having to handle them to some degree. There's a lot more to it than just that. And here, I'll give you another example of a different bat. I'm just going to roll this same tape. I think there's another one in here that's going to sound more like a chuck, 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 or chirp, chirp, chirp. Okay, see if you can hear it. And that's a bigger sized bat. It's probably a silver-haired or a big brown, one of the two. Hear that little chirp? Yeah. So you got a couple of different bats flying around in the same space. And that was a feeding buzz. Did you hear that? Yeah. It's pretty cool. There's one little problem with that, though. I don't know if you had time to think this through, though. It's what we call relative abundance. You can never get absolute abundance with most mammal species anyway. Absolute being there's 10 animals. So we call it relative. Like this site is twice as active as this site relative to this site. Okay. So imagine this. Okay, we don't know if that's one bat making 1,500 passes or 1,500 bats making one pass. So there's a little bit to be worked out yet. And then we can also do active recording where I can take the laptop with the software on it and take it right out into the field. And we call them in with a little guitar song, and pretty soon the bats come. The human ear can only hear up to about 20 kilohertz. Bats are way above that, so we can't hear them. Unless you went to a lot of rock concerts, you're probably in the 10 kilohertz zone. The baseline, what we call, is about 50 kilohertz. Only 2 bats have a 50 kilohertz base. So sometimes we group them. We don't know exactly what species that is just by the call. So we just put it in a 40 kilohertz group. And now that chirp one that you heard, silver-haired bat, way down there at about 22 at the base. So just quickly, here we lumped 50K and 40K and 30 to 35. And pretty much, the 50s and 40s are one of 2 bats. And I don't want to get into too much detail on this, but it just gives you an idea of what's out there. And sometimes big browns and silver-haireds are hard to tell, so we lump them too. Just a note on this, if you were to do some sampling, you kind of want to know what's your best period to do that, or else you're going to be out there till 05:30 when there's no bats. Pretty much like 9:30 to 11:30 is the optimal feeding period. And then, I don't know, have you ever heard of a dichotomous key? Is that new to you? So whenever we key these guys out, they're really hard, actually. A lot of bats look similar in the hand. So you go through this key, and the first thing, we're talking about the ears. We get on that right away. Are the ears greater than 25 millimeters or less than? And then you just keep going through this key, and eventually you get to the bat that it is. And it works pretty well. And so we sex them. They're just like every other mammal. They're not too hard to tell the difference. And we age them. Now, how do you age a bat? Gee whiz, who would have thunk it? You can do that. Well, you can age them either adult or juveniles. And the juvies, later in the summer, they're pretty equal weight. They're hard to tell the difference. But if you shine a light from the bottom up and look at the wing joints, if they're totally calcified, meaning you cannot see through them, then it's an adult. If you can see through them and there's some white mass in there, then it's a juvie. And we measure that forearm. That's pretty key because that helps you identify what bat species it is. And then we release it and get a recording from it. And then that's called a voucher call. So then we can compare that and we know that call is indeed from that species of bat. So we use that as a reference. There's a whole library of those that you can access on the internet now, in case you need something to do in the winter. Captures are difficult for some species. Those 747s fly higher in the sky. They're almost above the canopy. It's hard to get a net that high. You need pulley systems, which has been done. But I think over here on the east side, it might be a little easier to catch them because they all have to come down to get water. And you can isolate where that water is. Water is isolated quite often. Anyway, elevation is something most of us don't think about, but the number of females versus elevation is an inverse relationship, whereas the greater the elevation out there to 1,800 meters, the fewer female bats. So what this means is they select for lower elevations because that's where the quality habitat is usually, the bigger trees, more bugs, that kind of thing. And remember, the males have nothing to do with the females all summer or the young. They're just all over the map. And it's been said in the literature that this is because, one, they don't have the responsibility of taking care of the young, so they're more free to fly around wherever they want to go. And also, it could be an evolutionary thing in that they allow the females to have the best quality habitat at lower elevations. That sounds good, huh? A little research thing that we do to figure out where bats go. We put a little backpack radio transmitter on them, and we'll follow them with an antenna. Certainly some limitations to this because there's a ratio of the weight of the animal to the weight of the transmitter. And since they only weigh about, guess how much? 4 to 6 grams, these little brown bat. So that transmitter doesn't have a lot of battery life, is what I'm getting at. You're only good for about 2 weeks. So you can't do much with migration type stuff. But you can locate nursery colonies, roost sites, things like that. Another technique is a band that we use. You all have a western red bat, but this band, it doesn't penetrate the skin at all, just kind of tightly fits. And this is used for survivorship. We can see how long bats live if we recapture them. It's a mark recapture type thing. Oh yeah, good question. Someone asked, does the radio transmitter fall off? Yes, they're just glued on and it wears off in a couple weeks, basically. They're not terribly expensive either. And sometimes you can find them again with the antenna. It's like a needle in a haystack, but yeah, it does work. Just some more species that you have here. A red bat that actually migrates. You have an eastern species and a western species. In May, they're moving their way up California. June, so we're supposed to have this bat in this area, but western red bat and the eastern species as well. The western long-eared, fairly common, kind of a medium-sized bat. It looks pretty vicious, but they're not. Although one of those bit me one time. They're predators, you know. California bat, short little thumbs. The Yuma bat, this and the little brown are very similar, but I've had good success keying these out. You learn a few little tricks while you do this. This one's much more docile than, say, the little brown. That thing, we call it the little brat. You know, it's all over the map. And it's got more blondish hair. And your big brown, you definitely want to wear a glove when handling these ones. They're strong. I've had one in my hand and it just like crawled out of my hand. It was so tough. Silver hair, appropriately named, silver hair on the back. And one of my favorites, hoary bat. These are really hard to catch because they fly high in the sky above the canopy quite often. And also, this is our largest size bat. Long forearm on these. These are true migratory bats. We don't know where they go, but they go south somewhere. They migrate, so they don't really hibernate. They just go to warmer parts. So in January, they're kind of spread along the California coast as things warm up. In April, May, now we got them up here. In August, I think, is their peak period up here. Yeah, probably has something to do with the prey base. I don't know if I mentioned it, but a lot of different bats eat different bugs. Not every bat eats mosquitoes, for example. There's grasshoppers and beetles and all kinds of other things. So they have individual niches. You have probably one of the most colorful bats we have, spotted bat. And this one, you can actually hear, just barely. I think maybe more so female gender can pick this up. They hear better, higher frequencies. Townsend's big-eared. They seem to like to roost in buildings, too. And then, of course, did I mention they're nocturnal? Yeah. And if you work with bats, you soon become nocturnal as well. So we're wrapping things up here. Just quickly, some of the threats that we're all faced with here. Wind power is a new big thing. A great source of energy, of course, but these migratory bats seem to be caught in the middle of this. We're not sure why they gravitate to these wind turbines. There's a lot of work to be done on that yet, but it's usually the migratory bats that get caught up in that. Of course, urban sprawl and deforestation and mines. And of course, disease. There were some questions asked earlier about this. White nose syndrome is really something. It was discovered in the winter of 2006, 2007 in Albany, New York. And since that time, there's been an estimated 5.7 to 6.7 million mortalities in 19 states now. Let me just speak to that a little bit. It's a fungus called Disgusted. That's the species name. It's a new one, never been found before. Gets on their wings. It's an infection and wings in their muzzle area, and it somehow makes them wake up in the cave and when they're hibernating. And like I said before, that's pretty critical time to be woken up. So they kind of fly around erratically, and they might go to some colder parts of the cave and they get all disoriented and they basically deplete all their reserves and die. So it is moving. It seemed to have jumped the Mississippi River. It's in Arkansas and now Oklahoma. So really all it takes is somebody going into a cave out east and not washing their clothes or decontaminating them, and then coming to a cave out west, and boom, it's contaminated. That's one theory anyway. I'm hesitant to say that's exactly how it's transmitted. We don't know. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is behind all this with research and trying to come up with protocols how to deal with this. And there's a lot of funding available and work to be done.
Since this talk, white nose syndrome has continued to move west, although it has still not been observed in many western states. However, significantly for us in Okanogan County, the disease was found for the first time east of the Cascade Range in Kittitas County in 2019. There are some things that we can all do to help prevent the spread of this disease in our local bat populations. First of all, you can be observant and watch for bats. And if you see bats acting strangely, like flying during the day in the winter, or struggling to fly or get off the ground, you can call your local Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Also, stay out of caves and mines, especially during hibernation season, which is roughly December through March. And if you do go into and out of caves or come into contact with bats, you can decontaminate your clothes, shoes, and equipment when you come out to prevent the spread of the fungus.
Other needs that we have are to continue to do some inventories, like, for example, the Okanogan Highlands. I don't think too much work has been done here yet. There's a lot to learn. And is the absence of evidence of absence? I think Carl Sagan said that. Just because you didn't see them that one time doesn't mean they're not there. So multiple inventories are good. On and on. DNA analysis, like some are so hard to tell that between the species, you might have to take a wing punch and look at the tissue for DNA. Protecting hibernation sites is pretty key. And of course, the white nose syndrome, further research needs to be done there. And finally, what you can do, well, you can definitely get involved, join up with some of these conservation groups, just monetarily support is awesome. Volunteer if you know if there's some research going on around here. Protect and provide habitat, such as bat boxes. Some of you are familiar with that. A couple different ideas how to do that. The key thing is to put those on a south-facing building, south or east. It's all about warmth. And multiple chambers is always a good idea, so they have options throughout the day even. There's plans on these that you can Google for and get bat box plans. We tried to evict some bats out of a house, and so we put one box up, and it worked. We got 100 bats the first year, and then we put another one on the back side of it, and now we have like 250 the last time I looked. And you can look at the base of your box quite often and see if there's guano to see if it's being used. If they're not being used the first year, I'd give it another year, or after that, change the location. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Depends on what the habitat's like around the area, but they're pretty effective. Thanks for your support and helping me think like a bat.
This podcast is produced by Okanogan Highlands Alliance. OHA is located in Tonasket, a town in the heart of the Okanogan Valley of north central Washington. We are inspired by the beauty and diversity of the landscape that surrounds us, from the aspen and conifer forests to the highland lakes to the tumbling creeks that descend to the wide, glacier-carved Okanogan River Valley. We engage in environmental advocacy, habitat restoration, and educational activities in our efforts to protect local ecosystems for future generations. To learn more about OHA or to become a member, please visit our website, okanoganhighlands.org. Thanks to Roger Christophersen for providing the presentation and giving us a glimpse into the secret life of bats. The voice of Calvin in the introduction was by Owen Weddle. Theme song written and performed by Tyler Graves and Andy Kingham.
It's all that we are. We're all what it is, 'cause we're living with blessed unrest. Blessed unrest. Blessed unrest. Blessed unrest.